Well, we'd like to welcome everyone to the AES Atlanta section, audio tips, tricks, and secrets from your AES Atlanta section. I am the chair, Jameul, and we have our committee members here that will be presenting. We have Jeremy Dudman, we have Tim Jones, Marshall Young, and Jamie Baker. And as they present themselves, we're going to do a brief introduction of what they do and how they do it. But our first presenter will be Tim. So Tim Jones, go ahead and give us a brief introduction of yourself, how long you have been with AES on a committee, and what do you do in audio production?
So I've been with the Audio Engineering Society since 2009. I started as a student member, and I also was over the student section, for a year or so when I was in college. And then I joined the committee upon graduating. And so I've been a committee member. I've been a previous chair and secretary for the organization, and now I'm still serving on the committee now. Outside of working with AES, I have been a recording engineer, mix engineer, producer, and also working a little more on the integration side of things, design and implementation of systems for studios and spaces. And so mainly right now, I just mainly make records. So that's kind of the main thing I tend to do. Will we continue with introductions? Or am I jumping right in?
Sure, just jump right in. And then our next presentation, Our next presenter will introduce themselves and give them some background and let us know what they do.
Okay, well, great. So tonight, I was mainly going to talk about vocal production techniques. And it's kind of a broad area because there's a lot of aspects that I kind of look at when I am recording, vocals for a record. And it's kind of like I almost have a little bit of a checklist. It's not like there's necessarily this monotonous system that I have, but at least I try not to think of it that way. But I kind of have like this little mental checklist, especially for almost any number of things you can record and have in a song. And so when it comes to vocals, there are a lot of things I like to look at, especially in the pre-production process, because when it comes to production, the planning stage, the pre-production process actually is, very often, going to be kind of your roadmap of how you're going to navigate, the recording process and editing, and then all the way through pretty much the time that the record has been mastered and released. So when it comes to the planning stages, I like to first, think about, the vocalist that I would be recording and, vocalist, in terms of, is it just one individual? Are they doing all of the parts? Are there going to be multiple parts in the song? And then also, is it one of those things where I have to kind of help them figure out what they're actually going to be doing, performance wise? So a lot of times, and this kind of goes a little more broadly into the record production process, but I like to demo things out a lot of times. And so I'll demo out an entire song very often before I actually record the real thing. So I kind of just have a skeleton or a structure. And when it comes to the vocal aspect of that, I like to kind of, take a demo recording, which it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be, the most, amazing performance. It's just kind of an idea written down on paper is the way I look at it. And, just having a demo of a lead vocal or for a verse, for a chorus, for the entire lead vocal part in a song. From that, I can take that and kind of play with it and, throw it into another application, outside of, like using a DAW to record it. I can use an application like Melodyne, for instance, which is by definition, it is a DAW, but it's mainly used for pitch correction. If anyone isn't, familiar with Melodyne, you can use it to actually manipulate and alter the pitch, and create kind of a fake harmony, if you will. And so when it comes to like the production and the arranging side, you can actually use tools like Melodyne and even like Auto-Tune, for instance, to kind of give you a idea of what something may sound like. So it's kind of, allowing you to experiment with the technology. And so those are a lot of the early stages, that I like to look at, in planning, like what we're actually going to be recording. When it comes to the recording phase itself, talking a little more about technology, some things that I really like to consider is, like what type of equipment I'm actually going to be using data for the recording process, and that includes the microphone, the preamp, the converter. So, I look at those three things, especially being the most integral parts of the recording chain. And so, a lot of what I'm talking about right now, I guess, has more to do with, the raw recordings that you're going to end up getting and, actually, having produced and recorded. And so it's basically more about the front end process for me. And when I say that, I mean, I'm trying to capture the vocal as cleanly and as closely to what I want it to sound like, without having to do a lot of work on the back end, such as adding, let's say, a lot of signal processing, such as EQ, compression. I may very well do that on the front end side using hardware and equipment as opposed to plugins. But there's also, and I don't want to take a stance and say that one way is necessarily better than the other. I think at the end of the day, it's a preference thing. So really, whatever the engineer is more comfortable doing, whether it is applying signal processing on the front end or the back end, there are a few things that I definitely like to make sure that are, kind of evaluated in the process. And this is going to depend on the vocalist, because every vocalist has a different timbre, a different dynamic response, how they're going to be controlling their voice, when they have fluctuations from soft to loud. So a lot of things I like to look at evaluation wise when it comes to signal processing. I start kind of in this chain. I start with, equalization and filtering. And so I'm really looking to kind of see if there's, any part of the spectrum that needs to be, filtered or potentially, corrected to compensate for, the way that, the recording might have translated through the microphone or through the preamp, or any other part of the signal chain. And so, starting with EQing and filtering to kind of, take out any, extreme low end or rumble is usually, one thing I'll start with most vocalists, because unless you have a vocalist with an extremely low timbre or fundamental, they have a very low voice, someone like, use an example like Barry White. A lot of, lower frequencies aren't very relevant, to a lot of vocalists. A lot of extreme lower frequencies really below, like, let's say 60 hertz or so. So a lot of times you can filter that information out, especially if you're stacking or adding a bunch of, parts on top of each other. That information, those frequencies compound. And so it's, better to kind of take out a lot of, those specific frequencies that are going to add up and kind of junk up the mix a little bit. And so even on the top end of the spectrum as well, you may even consider with certain vocalists, taking off some of the upper frequencies, to let maybe some, vocalists be able to sit together better. So you may actually even filter off some top end frequencies. So EQ and spectrum and filtering is kind of the main place I start. Now, something I may also do before that, I like to add a lot of saturation to a lot of my sources. I make things sound very warm and very crunchy very often with a lot of sound sources, and vocals are one that I definitely tend to do that too, very often. And so if I don't feel like the recording has enough, warmth, when I say, like warmth, I'm talking mid-range and, kind of smoothness in the lower end of the spectrum, I might employ some form of saturation. Now, going back to what I said a second ago, with the equipment, the initial signal chain for recording, microphone, preamp, and then, converter. A lot of times, I would say the preamp and, in conjunction with your microphone is going to have a very dramatic effect on the tone of your recording. And so sometimes, depending upon what equipment you're using, your signal chain, the tone can be very pronounced. It could be very, it can have just a lot of saturation and fullness to it, and it may not need a lot of help. And so really depending upon, what you're working with at that point in time, whether it's a recording that has a lot of character to it or a recording that may be lacking a lot of character, might sound a lot thinner. Some things you may be able to employ signal processing wise that can help with that would be any form of like saturation plugin or tool. And so very often I rely very often on different forms of tape saturation. I'm very much often using Waves plugins, especially the Kramer tape plugin is one I use very often, if anybody's familiar with that. In fact, I will share my screen real quick. I don't know why Google is not showing that. Am I still good on time, guys? For about 5 more minutes? Okay.
Yeah, you got 5 minutes.
Okay. So the Kramer tape plugin from Waves I've been using for a number of years now, and it's been fairly reliable. I also like the J37, this one as well from Waves. But essentially what I use plugins like these for very often is if I feel like something just doesn't have, a very defined character, doesn't feel like it has, just, a lot of harmonic excitement, to it. This can actually sometimes, this technique, applying this to a vocal can help breathe some life into it. This is kind of the way I look at it. And so that's, something that you may or may not need to apply depending upon how saturated your recording may or may not be. So just something to consider. So outside of saturation, filtering, equalization, and, spectral effects, dynamic control is another thing that, is often, applied signal processing wise to a vocalist. So that gets us into talking about compression. Now, keep in mind also, you may be able to kind of accomplish some of the things I'm about to talk about with tape saturation or in other forms of saturation as well. So you might be able to actually, use a tape emulation plugin or saturation plugin to, in fact, be able to do some, dynamic range, adjustments or, some forms of compression. But in general, there's tons of different compressors on the market, both hardware and, in the form of plugins. And a lot of these plugins emulate what actual hardware devices, how they perform and how they behave. So for instance, Universal Audio is a very popular company that's putting out, some very sought after plugins in the moment. And so for instance, they've got the original compressor that you could actually still buy that's hardware. You could actually buy their plugin version, which it's considerably cheaper than the hardware, but both kind of have their own nuances in my opinion. It's one of those things where, again, I don't want to take a stance and say that the actual hardware is going to be better than the plugins. There's tons of debate on that, but I will say that, I've heard both in different contexts and both can sound great. So, so really, I guess, when it comes to compression for vocals, it really depends on the genre. It's one of those things where, if it's a very, let's say, mainstream pop vocal, you're probably going to apply a little bit more heavy compression. I will say this is one of my tips and tricks, I guess, for this evening. Hopefully you guys can see that. Zoom is telling me participants can now see my screen. Hopefully you're able to see it before. Let's see, can you demonstrate how to use one of these plugins? Yes, and so when it comes to, basically achieving like a decent amount of gain reduction or compression for a very, pop heavy vocal, something like, let's think any type of mainstream pop vocal. One plugin I've actually used very often, and it's kind of funny because a lot of folks tend to use this for, we'll say like pseudo mastering applications, is a plugin called L2 from Waves. And so I'll actually, real quick, just since I only have a minute or two left, I'm going to kind of pull up one of the vocals I have in Pro Tools. All right, hopefully you guys can see my screen. So I've got this one vocal here, my one lead vocal. And I'm just gonna solo. Let me know if you guys can't hear this. His eyes should more than make a man of me. There's only one thing on my mind. So the vocal right now, it's pretty much, it's fairly leveled out. Let's see. I didn't actually normalize that. I'm just going to bring the level up of this just a little bit just to help us out for this demo. So we should be on my mind that she'll be mine. So what I tend to do is I employ what's called serial compression. And it's, this isn't really much of a secret. It's something that, a lot of engineers are aware of. But the specific plugins that I use, I'll use two from Waves very often. She'll be mine. She's the. So I'm going to employ the first thing I mentioned before, the filtering. I'm actually just going to take out some low end. So very often what I'll do, and you really want to use your ears as much as possible instead of relying on numbers. So what I will tend to do is I'll actually just kind of overshoot my filters on purpose. And then I'll just kind of pull back until I feel like everything feels natural and I'm not taking anything away. And, hopefully, it's one of those things where you just need to, feel confident with how you're monitoring. Right now, I'm more or less, an earbud. So hopefully I can kind of nail this. See why it's not letting me. She'll be mine. She's the object of my fascination. She'll be mine. She's the object of my fascination. A little higher than I normally tend to go, but that feels pretty good. So the next thing, the main part I was wanting to show you is the processing chain. And this doesn't work for every vocalist, but I will say this is one of the compressor chains I tend to do a little more often than not. It looks like my plugin didn't load for this, but that's fine because I can still do this with two other plugins that are kind of close enough. I'll use the standard ones that come with Pro Tools. I tend to use the CLA 76 from Waves. It's a crystalloid algae signature version of the 1176 compressor. But pretty much what I do is I dial in pretty much the main peaks and get it to where they're just getting tapped very lightly with this compressor. And this one's going to sound a little different, but it's close enough for this. She'll be mine. She's the object of my fascination. She'll be mine. Other than maybe tweaking. She'll be mine. She's the object. So really, that's pretty close to actually what I wanted to do right off the bat. So what I look for in my waveform is pretty much the loudest peak, and it's probably this one actually here. Movie star. It's hitting a little bit harder than I want it to. So pretty much when you're dialing in a compressor or most compression settings, you really want to look for your loudest peak in your waveform. If available, if you can actually look at it or find it. And then that's kind of where you want to dial it in from. And so for me, I tend to try to get kind of this a little bit light, a very light touch with this first compressor. I really don't want more than like 3 dB of gain reduction. She's 10 out of 10. So this is just meant to kind of level things out a little bit and help so that those peaks don't eat up the energy that's going to go through the next compressor. So after that, I'll add limiter actually. So limiter is, it's, basically, without getting super into it, it basically is able to achieve a much greater reduction of dynamic range. And so it can be a little more aggressive than compressors can be at times. So with this one, when I pull the threshold down on this, it's basically going to push, my softer levels up in volume. And so I'm going to set it to where pretty much when I start pulling this back, it's going to start raising the volume, and it's basically going to get my levels, if I push it hard enough, and you guys can see this. She's 10 out of 10, a schoolboy fascination. A little harsh and a little gritty sounding. So it really depends on how much distortion you potentially want. But, usually I'll use a limiter to kind of help level things out and basically get that very, very slammed sounding pop vocal. And so the specific compressor I fortunately can't show you at the moment is the plugin L2 from Waves. And it operates very similarly to the one that I just showed you from Pro Tools Maxim. So just, I guess, another flavor, if you will. Am I at time or?
Yes, that's time, sir.
Okay. Well, I hit most of what I wanted to hit tonight. So
we appreciate you, Tim. If anyone has any questions for Tim, you can go ahead and go ahead. Ask. We'll take a couple questions for Tim. If not, feel free to post them in the chat box and we can move on to our next presenter, which will be Jamie Baker, one of our newer committee members. Go ahead and introduce yourself and then get into your topic, please.
Hello. Thank you, Jameul. I'm Jamie Baker. I am newer member. My origins in the AES are from the late 90s, mid 90s in New York. I had just moved there and I had been doing music engineering and I was pursuing that career, and I bumped into somebody mixing a film who I thought they were going to be mixing a jazz record, but I went to visit them in the studio and they're mixing a film. I was like, what are you doing? And then I said, oh my goodness, that is so cool. I want to mix film. So I joined the AES at some point then. And I went to a panel with all film mixers on it. And I introduced myself and, got my foot in the door. And my first sort of area I started working in was in Foley. And anyways, I stayed with the AES and I'm still with the AES now. About 2.5 years ago, after working in New York on film and television, many, many years doing Foley, doing mixing, re-recording, mixing reality shows, commercials and stuff, I came down to Georgia to teach at the Savannah College of Art and Design in their sound design program. And I'm very proud of my students. We got a student section together. And we also looked for a parent section around. Here's our closest AES section, which is Atlanta. So thank you for welcoming me, and I'm happy to be here and share some secrets. But they're not really secrets. But if you haven't worked in Foley before, you might wonder, like, oh well, how do we set it up in Pro Tools? So I was going to run a quick Foley cue. I guess I'll share my screen. Did I forget to tell anybody anything? I think that was it, right? My introduction. Okay, good.
Oh, you're fine.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you. All right, super. So this is a sample session. I pulled in a little video. It's very short. I've got the video here and the audio guide track underneath. Both of these are locked. Not sure if you often lock anything when you're doing music, but we definitely lock picture. And you can see the little icon in the corner. It's a clip function. You can unlock and that little lock goes away, or you can lock it. And we have to lock the picture because usually you work on a big crew. You have Foley, you have dialogue, you have music, all different people doing the different layers of the orchestra or whatever you want to, equate it with. Many people working on it. So we lock it in time. This starts at 1 hour. We have it burned in on the picture and we make sure it matches our timeline, and we make sure we lock it, because if it's not locked, it can slip. And then you'll keep working thinking everything you're doing is in sync. But then when you merge it with everybody else, it's like a big mess. So that's one important thing that we do. And we also, when I record, I was trained always, we equalize as we go. We want to print what we want to hear. So I use an auxiliary channel to bring in my microphone for recording Foley. So if I need to, equalize anything as I go, it will print to the track rather than me have it sound the way I want, but it's actually printing something neutral. And then I give that to the editor and they're like, what's this? So I definitely like to put an equalizer in my way in there. Because we're not using, like we used to have our old analog boards and go straight in and EQ as we go. Now we're all digital. We go in through mic pre's, but everything is pretty much software based now as far as that goes. So I have my EQ. This is bust straight to my record track. And for media management, I have two screens going here. Every time I record a cue, I need to name it because that's what it'll be called in my clips list. That's what it will be called forever. So if I'm going to run a cue, this little cartoon has this man, I think he's a toy maker for Pixar. I just borrowed this. I didn't work on the real thing. And he takes off his glasses and puts them down. And so I'm gonna show you how I do that cue. First, what I would do is call it glasses AX, short for action, glasses X. And I could say glasses action to wood or down wood table if I wanted to. But the more words you put, there's too many words. But it is also handy, like if I ever need something with glasses later and I search for it, if it says wood table, I'll be like, oh, glasses down wood table. So it is kind of handy to have some information on there. So you can say glasses down wood, glasses down, even just glasses down wood is probably enough information. So I'll show you the cue with the guide track. It's at the very beginning. I'll turn off my beeps for a minute here. And that's it. So something we do for film and television, especially animation, as you can imagine, there is no location audio. It's animated. So every single sound has to be made from scratch. And so a Foley artist, which is not by trade me, I'm not the artist. I'm the person recording the artist and editing the Foley. I'm usually on the other side of the glass, but I do some Foley artistry when I work with my students, of course. But people that are dedicated Foley artists, they're way above. They're athletic. They are, athletic. They're actors because they get into character for everybody whose sounds they're performing. So that's a whole art of itself. But I can do a glasses cue pretty well. And I have what's here is called, I call it a blank slug. So sometimes we pre-cue, we usually pre-cue stuff, but if I want to, what this blank slug is in Pro Tools is it's just a group clip that's called blank slug. So it's not a piece of media. It's not taking up any space on my drive, but what we do is we find where the beginning of the cue is. He's grabbing his glasses right around there. So that's my in. And then he puts them down right about there. And that's about the end. So I selected a piece on the blank slug there. One trick I like to do, there's many ways I can copy and paste this down below, but I prefer to use this separation option on the grabber tool here. And then when I hover there and I hold Control and Option, I can click and drag it down and boom, it locks it in time. When I hold Control, it doesn't slip left or right. And Option makes a copy. So now I have my cue here. So I can actually name the cue. If I was prepping this for someone else, I could also name it glasses down wood. And there's my cue. When I'm ready to roll it, I put on pre-roll, post-roll. Whoops, I did not mean to do that. Oh, that's pretty cool. What's going on? And I use Quick Punch. Many of you might know Quick Punch, but with Quick Punch, it's not as scary as it used to be when we're using analog tape. When you're punching in recording, if you use pre-roll and post-roll, you get these little hidden handles. So if you accidentally are a little off, you can fix it. But that's good because the person you're recording, the Foley artist, might come in a little early or they might linger a little late. So you'll have it in the handles. If that doesn't make sense, I'll show you what that means in a sec. For anybody wondering, what is she talking about? So I have my cue ready to go. And these beeps, I'll show you how to make these beeps, but we use them to cue when to start performing. So I'll play them by themselves. They are 1 second apart. They could be a different length, but we generally do 1 second apart. There are 3 beeps, and then where there would have been a 4th beep, there is no 4th beep, but that's when you go. So go. That's where you would go. So what we do is we line those up so that they will cue you in to do this glasses action cue. And shortcut in Pro Tools, Control Command, whatever you have selected, Control Command plus grabber will snap it right to it. So you might not remember all that, and that's okay, but you can imagine when we're doing 200 cues a day, you just want to snap those beeps and keep going and going for all of your cues. So if somebody pre-cues a whole reel for me, I can just open, I can double click. I don't have to always drag the window to my other window. That's a Zoom thing, but I will copy the name, paste it on my record track, and then every single cue that I do of glasses on wood would show up in here pre-queued. I can just run through all of them. And let's try one. So it will go beep, beep. And that's that. So I'm going to record one of those. I'm going to mute the guide track and point my mic a little bit. I'm just going to do it right on the desk here. So you won't actually see me do that part, but oh, goodness gracious. I know some people say you should mute, but on the Foley stage, the Foley artist never mutes. And some people might say that's bad for the speakers, but that just happens. Okay, so here goes my cue. I'm going to have these off because my headphones are attached. I'm going to do a grab and a down. My computer is also, fans are spinning. So forgive me if that goes on the recording, but I'm kind of hoping that Zoom is going to clean that up, because Zoom is cleaning up a lot of things today. But for a job, I wouldn't rely on Zoom to clean up my audio. Okay, here I go. So that just gives an idea what we would do. So me as the Foley mixer, I'll hold the control key and pull this down because control locks it in time. And then I'll play it back and see, gee, does that work? Also, I turn off pre-roll and post-roll, and I can command K as a shortcut and just hear it back. It's not bad. And I must say, yes, I've done this cue before, so I got lucky on that one. But if had I gone a little early, if I grabbed the glasses a little early, because I have this quick punch in and I use the pre-roll and post-roll, I actually have handles. So I can save myself and fix it. Also, usually I don't do it so well in time, or if I went a little late, I could pull out the end that way. That is pretty much it. The only thing I want to do from here is show you quickly how to make cue beeps in case you need to cue, because you need to do this for dialogue as well. So if you're ever in the studio and somebody says, hey, can you do some ADR for a couple lines for someone? And you're like, oh, I wish I had some beeps. They're pretty easy to make. Generally, I go into grid mode and I set my grid to 1 frame and I zoom in, and that locks me, my selections will stick frame like that. And I will put a signal generator right there, a 1 frame signal generator. Oh gosh. Zoom loves to put my things all in strange windows. And I'll render that. Now I have a beep and we can't hear it because I'm not on the beeps track. Let me undo that, because what I should do is do it on this cue beeps track and it will get named cue beeps. So that's good for media management. There we go. There we go. Now I change my grid mode to 1 second because I want to put these 1 second apart. So this is the easiest way to space them out. I can use the Option key to duplicate, and it snaps right to my next location. And then 3, I can consolidate the clip. There's shortcuts for this. I test my students on that. What is it to consolidate a clip? And then I give them some strange options, and it's a Shift Option 3. Anyway, consolidate clip. Now I have a clip, cue beeps, and ready to go. So you can save those and import them into any session you want. Just have some beeps for any sort of post-production sync you're doing. And I think that's everything I was going to show you today. Happy to answer questions. Yeah, that's about it.
Any questions for Jamie? Great presentation. Great presentation. Any questions?
Thank you so much.
If you don't have any questions now, feel free to post them in the chat as well, and we'll take a look at those. Next on our list, we have Marshall Young, another committee member.
Hey, Marshall, while you do that, I'm noticing some things in the chat. Some people are saying they can't hear your voice. I can hear you fine. Is there anybody else? I know somebody saying maybe on iPad issue. Anybody else noticing anything? I'm hearing you loud and clear though.
Yeah, I'm hearing them clear as well.
That tends to fix it. So hopefully those who can't hear can now, hopefully. Sorry about that, everybody. At any rate, this is a spring that I recorded at 192, and you bring it in to your Pro Tools session. Sounds like a spring, not terribly impressive. But if you import it, and when you select it and hit convert, if you don't apply the sample rate conversion and you hit done, it's going to be like, are you sure this is a weird thing to do? You say, yes, I'm positive. And you import it like that. Now you have the exact same recording, but it's playing at 1/4 the speed and 2 octaves lower. So it's going to sound like a much bigger spring. And that gives you a lot of options for some creative sound design. The two things that always indicate size is pitch. Bigger things have lower pitches, and then the space that it's in. So if you record this in a small space, and then you slow it down, it's going to sound like it's in a bigger space. So that works pretty well. Let's see another example. Metal plate. Number 1. This was actually part of a car jack that had broken off. It was smaller than a dinner plate, and I just tossed it onto the floor. Not very impressive, but if we don't do the sample rate conversion, it'll sound a lot bigger. So, tiny piece of metal, but sounds like a bigger item. Let's see. Let's skip to the bok choy. So the bok choy would be in produce. Bok choy. Let's just grab number 1, convert it. So this was me making sound effects for a little zombie film when I was in school. It's crunchy. And if we bring it in and we don't do the sample rate conversion, then like it sounds like a tree breaking or moving a lot of earth or something. It opens up a lot of possibilities, but it's just a piece of bok choy from Kroger. Let's see. This one's in a different folder. I had an intern over the summer and I had her do some of these same kinds of sound effects. So we want Zoom 13 track number 2. We'll convert that, throw it in there. Yep, yep. And then we'll do Zoom 13 track number 2, convert, and take off the sample rate conversion. So this was in our theater. We have a balcony and we took a big boom microphone stand and we hung a slinky from it, and then we put a contact microphone on the bottom of the slinky, and we would have someone hit the slinky, and in real time it sounded like this, which is a pretty fun laser sound. It's pretty consistent. And if that was the only sound we recorded, that'd be great, but since we overcranked or oversampled the recording, we can play it back at partial speed and it'll be lower, so it's going to sound like a bigger laser. A lot more low frequency content, and it can be a more dramatic laser. So if you needed like a laser blast for a hand laser, and then you needed like a spaceship laser that's way bigger, same amount of work, but it gives you a lot more options. And then for the last one, let's bring in Who's in the record session, audio files, vacuum number 1. We'll convert it. Okay. Then we'll do it again. Vacuum 1, convert, and no sample rate conversion. When I was in grad school, I recorded like an air mattress air pump, and I had friends bring in hair dryers because I needed the sound of a spaceship, like a jet engine, and jet engines are dangerous to record, but hair dryers are pretty safe. So any kind of spinning machine like a vacuum cleaner can make some pretty pleasant sounds. It's a backpack vacuum cleaner. It's not very impressive. What I really liked is it's when it's wind down. It's wind down when you turn it off. It's very melodic kind of a vacuum cleaner. But when you put it at half speed or quarter speed, it'll sound more like a jet engine. And then the wind down is fun. And it goes and it goes and goes. And if there's one thing I like more than a wind down, it's a wind up. So we can go into your audio suite, select your clip, render it, and now instead of winding down, it'll have this build, which is really handy for building tension. So yep, that's my recommendation. When you record sound effects, oversample, and it'll give you a lot more options in post-production to have sounds that are organic and they sound real and they don't have the artifacts of using plugins to pitch shift it down 2 octaves. It'll have this full fluidity, this organic nature that you can hear it sounds real, and it'll kind of sell the authenticity of whatever you're creating. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Marshall. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Now we have our vice chair, Jeremy Dudman, who is going to go over his tips and tricks and secrets.
Hey everyone, my name is Jeremy, as Jameul said. So thanks everybody for coming out and joining us on this whatever day of the week it is. I know we're all tired, so I don't even know what day it is. So thanks for everybody coming out. Anyways, so I teach currently at the Art Institute of Atlanta, and I've been in AES since I think 2010 when I was finishing up grad school at MTSU. And went out to Houston, worked in studios. My background is just recording in studios and recording bands and being a bass player, guitarist myself, and taught out there too in Houston, and then originally from Atlanta and moved back here. And so really excited to be on the committee, and joined a few years ago as the secretary and now the vice chair. So as vice chair, I do want to throw out one little thing because I think Jameul might mention it later, but we're both in charge as vice chair and chair of kind of recruiting the next committee. So I'm going to go ahead and throw it out there because it's kind of my job. So if anybody wants to take part on our committee, and if you are in the Atlanta section, keep an eye out for your email because we will be recruiting for new committee members. So if you want to help kind of plan other events like this, we're looking for others to join. And our 2-year commitments are almost up. Well, not really, at the end of this year. So, but we're starting to recruit now. So just want to throw that out there anyways. But yeah, I also advise our student section, like Jamie at the at SCAD. We have a student section here at Art Institute of Atlanta. And so, yeah, today I'm going to present something that I talk a lot about in my classes as well. I'm going to share screen. So in terms of recording, I like to think about kind of, I don't know, to bring everybody's ideas together, kind of like what Tim said about maybe starting at the beginning of the process, and kind of thinking about maybe not having to do too much later. So I think about two things if I'm getting drum sounds in the beginning, and phase. So this is on the mixing side. So of course, hopefully we fixed phase while we recorded, but I'm going to mention phase, and then a cool trick. I think it's a trick using something like torque by Waves, which I found to work really cool. And it's kind of, I don't know if I don't think I came up with this term, but I call phase like pre-EQ, because I'm trying not to EQ actually. And I know we can do EQ for cool special effects and things like that. But first I'll talk about phase, just kind of verify phase. And I hope we all kind of know about phase. But I kind of talk to my students about it and just want to bring it up in case you maybe make you think about some different ways of thinking about phase, but we can use polarity to fix that. That's kind of the first thing that we might think about. We can just nudge the waveforms over. And then also I want to mention cool tools like auto align. I use auto align. There's tons of plugins out there now. I think it's pretty popular. I just see how manufacturers are making plugins. And so I've used auto align for years, going back to the Houston studio in Houston. And when it first came out by Sound Radix. I know Waves has one called In Phase. SSL has one. Nugent Audio had like a giveaway like last week or 2 weeks ago. It might still be going on. Little Labs had the one, and they still have the one through UAD if you're in their platform. So lots of cool ways to adjust phase. So anyway, so what's phase? This is a listening example from the Telefunken multitracks too. From if you just search Telefunken multitracks, we use those in class from the Telefunken labs. Yeah, I'm just going to solo out. I think I'll solo out drums. Oh, I think I didn't do something. Did I share sound? I did share sound. Everybody hear something? Yes? Okay, cool. I don't teach on Zoom, so I apologize. We had all this stuff before. So my school is odd. We use other things, and we're back in person now, so thank goodness. But anyways, so we have some audio here. So something, if I record it, I hope that I did the right thing when I recorded it and checked phase and verified phase. Sometimes we can't, right? So it's just a quick session, and you go try to set up all the mics, and you put 2 mics on the kick drum. Well, we might have some phase issues. We put 2 mics on a snare drum. You might have some phase issues. All of the drum mics working together, we might have some phase issues. I'm talking about drums too, specifically with this, but we might also do it with the bass, right? So when we play the bass tracks together, there's a DI and an amp. And just physically, unless you're using the cool radial DI that you can adjust phase live, you're probably not able to physically move the amp forward in time or move the DI back in time. So sometimes it's outside of our control, right? So no matter what, if I record it or I don't record it, I'm kind of checking phase, thinking of phase. My students are very visual, I've learned, and I'm visual too, but sometimes, of course, we use our ears. So I'm just going to listen first. So I put the trim plug in, and I might solo out the kick. We'll just start with kick. Let's make sure I bypass these other things. So I'm just going to flip polarity. We'll see if it sounds better. Whatever better is, we'll just see if it sounds better. So here's flipped. Here it is out. Let me make sure I'm not flipping anything else. Okay, yes, because I went through a few different versions of this. So we kind of listen. So usually when we're thinking about phase, I'm thinking about warmth and kind of body too. So, and that's why I kind of call it pre-EQ, because I find at least my students and a lot of maybe some other people, they'll spend hours EQing something, and I'd rather spend those hours with my family, doing fun things rather than EQing the darn kick drum, right? So that's why I kind of call it pre-EQ, or maybe I got that from somebody, I don't know. We can also look at the waveform. So we can also kind of zoom in on the waveform and see how this looks and maybe look at the transient. And I admit I did cheat a little bit, that I actually pushed these back in time. So you might just physically align these, right? So in terms of phase, we want them kind of starting either at the same time. So they're reinforcing the waveforms together rather than doing some cancellation. So when it's 180 degrees out of phase, then polarity might help. But then what if it's not 180 degrees? What if it's 90 or 32 degrees, right? So then that's when kind of the next step would be, maybe I actually physically move them over. So let's just kind of listen, and maybe I'll visually move it over and kind of hear some differences. And hopefully you have some good headphones or speakers, and hopefully it's translating a little out there, that you can kind of feel a little bit more warmth, and it just sounds and feels good. It feels like a kick, right? And sometimes it's not as noticeable, and if it's not an issue, then I move on, right? I'm not going to kind of spend too much time on it. I just do it and move on. But if it actually helps it, then I'll flip polarity or physically move it. Another thing that we can do too is actually, as I mentioned, the third step is maybe use something like auto align. So auto align, again, by Sound Radix, works kind of internal side chains or busing between the plugins. So you insert one on, let's say, the kick in, insert another version on the kick out, and then they have these internal linkings and chainings between them. So I might think the kick in is closest, so I might send from the kick in, and then the kick out might listen to that. On the kick out, whichever one I'm listening or I'm trying to align, I might hit detect and I hit play. It takes a little bit, but it does all the good stuff for you. And it'll actually sense however much it is out of phase, right? And it'll align it. And I found this was great. I don't do as much hourly work anymore since I'm teaching and then kind of just mixing from the house. But in hourly sessions, sometimes, they book a 4-hour session. They will use 3 hours and 50 minutes to record, and you get 10 minutes to come up with a magic mix, right? So sometimes instead of wasting hours EQing, that's why I call it the kind of pre-EQ, I might throw this on the kicks, maybe the snares together, maybe the bass DI and the amp, things like that, to try to get just a more solid sound. So then they walk out the door, at least happy with what we just spent the last 3 hours and 50 minutes on, and then hopefully they'll call me back, of course. So let's hear it kind of with auto align and without, maybe see if we hear a difference. So with, I'll do without. With. So again, these plugins I think are great if it's not exactly 180 degrees out of phase, because polarity will only work so much magic. I know the Little Labs works really well. I saw somebody showing that off recently, and so UAD has that Little Labs, which is a model of the actual physical unit, and you can actually vary that however you want. You kind of use that as special effect too, and so it's not a plugin doing it for you, but I find again, when speed is of essence like this, then auto align works well. Real quick, maybe on the bass as well, I think really works well. Again, if I just do trim, it might fix it, maybe or not. So let's hear it with, out, and then I'll flip polarity. actually gets worse. So that's a good sign. So that's probably an indicator that it was maybe already flipped or in phase. And yeah, maybe somebody did the work in ahead of time and actually got them somewhat in phase. Let's purposely put them kind of more out of phase in here. But let's say we don't want the plugin to do, or we don't want Trim to do it. We can use auto align, and I kind of set it up again on the DI that reaches the recorder first. So that's sending on 3. I think auto align can do up to 10 instances. And then the amp is listening, and then it's already detecting, and it's going to do all the fun stuff for us. Kind of wimpy bass. Bass. And as a bass player, crushes my heart to hear wimpy bass. We got to hear bass. So I'm all with you on Marsha when you're saying, you know, bass is important. And then I stopped listening because it's just important. It doesn't matter what situation, it's just important. That's me as a bass player. No, of course I was listening the whole time. Anyways, I like to kid. So that's a little bit on phase. Again, NewGen Audio has one, Waves in phase, SSL has one, Little Labs. It doesn't matter what you're using, or just spend the time to nudge it over. Just make sure all your tracks are in phase. Even like this session, I won't play one, but like the typical, well, this one says condenser, but the Royer and the 57, right? So sometimes, you know, we try to make sure that they're aligned, but maybe they're not aligned. If you actually do want to use both of them at the same time, please make sure they're in phase. It'll save you a lot of heartache and headache when you're EQing. And also one other thing too, in terms of warmth, trying to feel the bass, feel the guitar, just have that warmth in body, because I find it's a lot easier to take stuff out because we can always filter rather than add something there that's not there to begin with, right? If there's no warmth, you can excite it, you can add things, you do cool tricks, but right, I'd rather start with everything there and then be able to filter it out later. So that's why I want to make sure things are in phase. And then cool thing with torque. So torque, you can use this with maybe samples and so forth, but I think it's really cool with live drums as well. And so we can use Trigger or Drumagog or something else to kind of sample and trigger some, kick samples at the same time and blend it in. But if I want to keep it a little bit more natural and a little bit more, maybe somewhat true to the original, then again, I'm going to mess with it. But this kind of plays with the tuning of the drum. So again, hopefully it's well tuned to begin with, but maybe the drummer comes in with a piccolo snare or just some kick that, you know, has some bite, but it doesn't have the warmth. So I find torque works really well. So here's the kick kind of without again. So shifting from phase, not to confuse it with phase, something totally different, but also dealing with the drums even before I would do EQ. So I know I've got all these out of order. Maybe I'd put all these in order. I don't know why I have EQ up there, sorry. So maybe I do my phase and then I get torque, and then I would plan to EQ and compress and spend hours and hours. Here's without, sorry. So torque is really cool. It'll show you the graph of what's going on. And so I can kind of hone in on, sorry, I did some shortcuts in Pro Tools and I muted myself in Zoom really quickly. Oh, there we go. It's pretty cool. You can hover over to and kind of listen to this and kind of solo it out. So that's kind of like EQs do that as well. But then you kind of hover over the money notes, as I call them, and then you can actually tune it down. How low can you go? Maybe not that low. And we might have to trim it back because it's clipping now. We can also maybe make it a piccolo kick if there's such a thing. Probably would not do that, but without, maybe with a little bit of torque. Same thing with the snare. Maybe play with the snare a little bit. Kind of start with the same setting. And sometimes too, you might play with the harmonics, maybe like the fundamentals, not the best one to tune down, maybe go up to some of the harmonics. And it's doing some of the waves magic. It's kind of, they call it the resynthesis. It's not exactly just pitch shifting. It's kind of, I don't know if it's granular going on and it's reconstructing in it. So it's kind of keeping as much of the waveform as possible, but then also allowing you to just kind of pitch it up and down in essence. And sometimes I might have to lower the threshold. There we go. So without, with, so again, whether it's more natural or not, you know, the snare, the drummer might get a little mad saying, well, that's not my snare. I totally did this to a piccolo snare one time. I kind of lowered it down and made it sound like a real snare should sound. No offense, but you can have fun with it, right? And that's before I even EQ it, because maybe I'm lacking some warmth. Maybe I don't have good samples on me wherever I'm at, or I just don't want to bring in samples and make these drums sound like every other drum set and make it sound like pop music. I want it to sound like that drum, right? With a little bit of torquing. So, yeah, so that's my 2 cents. Phase and having fun with things like this torque kind of get you out of just EQing and things like that and wasting time. Like I said, go spend more time with your family. That's what I've got.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. Any questions for Jeremy?
Jeremy, do you ever tune the drums to be in the same key as the song? Has that been...
Thank you, Marshall. I should have said that. Yeah, so definitely like toms. Like if we don't have time, because who has time in the studio to actually do all that anymore? Because they're just come in, punk band, yeah, I'm going to play whatever. And then you can spend some time. So totally after the fact, I might tune the toms a little bit, even the kick and snare. So if they're ringing, I find that fits. Yeah, perfect. Thank you for mentioning that, because that saves a lot of heartache too, and making sure that, you know, maybe especially if it's an 808 and you can't tune it, it's not MIDI anymore and you need to tune it to the rest of the song, things like that. Perfect tool for that. Yeah. Thanks so much, Marshall, for mentioning that.
Any other questions for Jeremy? Any questions at all for our presenters? No questions? Well, good. Because we're open for questions. Well.
No questions. I just want to say all of you are so awesome. And thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you for doing the presentation.
Super cool to see all that stuff. Thank you, Jeremy and Marshall.
Oh, yeah.
Tim, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. This is a lot of fun.
And to throw it out there again, if anybody wants to join the committee, take some leadership roles with us. We're always looking for, you know, new people to bring some, you know, new life in and make suggestions. And even if you're not on the committee and you want to make some suggestions, we're always open to suggestions of events throughout the year. So we've got some news coming out soon of upcoming events. So.
Hey, Jeremy, I have a question yet about your presentation. When you're working on the phasing of just one instrument with the different tracks it's been recorded with, how is that affecting that instrument's relationship with the rest of the band?
Yeah, good question. So especially if it's live, right? Like,
yep.
Or maybe within the drum set itself.
Yes.
You know, maybe because there's a kick mic or a couple of kick mics and snares. So yeah, good question. Sometimes I will think about that, and in terms of like the overhead. So I'll actually kind of sync everything to one thing, like the snare or the overhead, sync to the overheads. Yeah, it's something that it's not just within 2 mics on the kick or 2 mics on the snare. It's a good point. It's kind of listening together. Outside of the drum set, I don't know if I actually worry about if there's too much drums bleeding into everything else. I hope that we've kind of situated that while we've recorded. But I know like in one of our rooms on campus, the rooms are not isolated. And some of the students find that out when they're trying to do live tracks, and the drummer's not so good. And then the acoustic guitar player's in the next room and it's not exactly isolated. That's not just phase. That's when they start editing and things like that. So that's a whole nother thing. I guess not exactly phase, but I hope that we've just recorded it well and close mic'd it enough that we don't have to worry between instruments.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. But I will say I've tuned live recordings, and I can get away with a little bit of tuning the lead vocal just a little bit, because then maybe connected to that, there's a little bit of bleed from the rest of the band. And of course, if you tune up the lead vocal too much, now all of a sudden you're tuning the rest of the band up, any of that bleed, or you tune down the bleed. So you can only go so far, but you can definitely tune live within reason.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Ed.
Right. So we're closing out. Thanks everyone for showing up, and have a good evening.
Thanks, everybody. That was great.
Take care. Thank you again.
Yeah.
Take care.